So last time we talked about how the poskim in the early 15 and mid 1500s assumed that the children of the conversos are considered Jewish. They should do a brit milah and a recommendation to go to the mikveh as well, though not mandatory. Before we see the evolution of that status, one other fascinating question during that century and slightly beyond was, what is the status of their marriages? Conversos who married one another, what's the status of their marriage? Because what happens if they married and then one of them was able to escape? Let's say a female converso got married and then she escaped and now she's gone to a new country and she wants to marry someone else. What's their status in terms of, does she need a get from her husband, and that's not possible, or do we consider her not married? So why would we consider her not married if she did a kiddushin with her converso husband? So here we have to understand that kiddushin, for marriage to take effect, it has to take effect between a male and female in the presence of two kosher witnesses. If two male kosher witnesses, if either of the two kosher of the witnesses are not kosher, then the kiddushin, the marriage, doesn't take effect. The definition of a witness who is kasher is someone who keeps Torah and mitzvot. Someone who blatantly neglects Torah and mitzvot is not considered a kasher witness. And so perhaps one could argue that the kiddushin which they did, these conversos, between themselves with converso witnesses, are invalid kiddushin, and therefore there is no marriage, and therefore the woman doesn't need a divorce, and therefore she can remarry in her new location without needing a get. So here there are different views. Some took the view that, look, although the halakha is very clear that one needs to give up their life rather than convert to another religion, but if one does so, they're not considered, it's wrong to do so, but it's not punishable like you served avodah zarah. Because anything which you do under duress, the Rambam wrote about this already a few hundred years before that, in his Igeret Hashmad, his letter on conversion, where he wrote very clearly that although, of course, a person needs to give up their life when faced with the question of converting to Christianity or dying, they need to do so. But if they didn't do so, they are still complete kosher Jews. And even if they serve avodah zarah, proper avodah zarah, still they've done something wrong. By the end of the day, they did it under honest, under duress, and therefore they still retain their full kosher Jewish status, and they're still considered God-fearing Jews, despite the fact they've done something wrong. And you still have to love him, and you still have to treat him well, and he has to do teshuvah for what he did. But at the end of the day, he's still considered a kasher person. And so, based on that, there were those who wrote in the 15th century, in the 1500s, they wrote that even though the Anusim, the conversos, were wrong for what they did, for converting outwardly, it was wrong what they did, but nonetheless, they're still considered kosher witnesses to be able to verify the kiddushin, and therefore the marriage between these conversos are acceptable conversions, and therefore they need to have a get. That was one view taken. However, the later view taken, this was by the Maharival, Rabbi Yosef ben Levi from Turkey at the end of the 1500s, was that a lot of the conversos, although they began as that, doing so only under duress, but as time progressed, they ended up giving up everything, and they ended up even privately, blatantly desecrating and not observing the mitzvot. And in short, his conclusion was that those who come to another country, we can assume that their kiddushin are not a kiddushin, because most likely the witnesses were not kosher witnesses, and therefore the woman can remarry. And so you see the tension here in terms of how to view these anusim for different aspects. On the one hand, they're still Jews, at least in the 1500s. On the other hand, are they kosher enough to be able to witness a marriage and to validate a marriage? Well, some were saying yes, but essentially, as time went on, it became more and more the view that no, you don't need to accept this at all because the witnesses were necessarily considered to be invalid.